history doesn't happen in vain.
Hmm.
When you hear that, where does it take you? It takes you to the church, right? Because life is not in vain, because life has a
Oh.
purpose, right? The idea of progress um, is perhaps the most important part of the emergence of the discipline of history.
Dr. Ghamari-Tabrizi, it's a pleasure to have you on our program again. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. How have
Thank you.
how have philosophies and conceptions of history developed differently in the Middle East than in Europe and European founded nations such as the United States?
Mm. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me again. And I thought that after the first conversation, you would never ever contact me, but I was, but I was wrong. You know, I've been wrong before, and
It's our
I'm the
pleasure to have
first.
you back, Dr. Ghamari-Tabrizi.
And so that's an important question, of course, and a very difficult one to answer. And I think the relationship with history is something that is articulated and has become like a academic pursuit only in the last 150, 200 years. It's a very new kind of phenomena that the people start to think about history. And I say why I'm saying this, because people can say that in ancient times people wrote history,
Yeah. Yeah.
but this, it's a very, very different kind of history. It's a history that has a very specific meaning embedded in it, right? When in ancient times people were writing history, that it was mixed with mythology, it was mixed with chronicles, events happened, people recorded the events and linked one event to another event.
That almost sounds
But
like
it's
storytelling.
absolutely, I mean, you read my mind,
Yeah, yeah.
because history then it's only in the past. It's basically a post-enlightenment. When we say post-enlightenment, we are thinking about 18th and 19th century
Mm-hmm.
um, endeavor that suddenly people started to think about history as something that has an internal logic to it. Like it's like unfolding in a particular way. Of course,
Oh.
when you look at history, there are like zillions of different things that are happening out there. How do you pick and choose? How do you make sense of event X and event Y, and put those together in a what people in my world call in a narrative that has a beginning, it has an end, it has a middle, it has a climax, and then it moves towards some form of conclusion. That kind of history, when we talk about history, there's a very famous expression that they say that history is made by the historians,
I
and
thought it was history was made by the winners or written by the winners.
no, history is made by the historians.
Interesting.
Some of historians are winners, some of them are losers.
Oh,
The
so funny.
historians who got a good job, they are the winners. Historians who didn't find a good job, they are the losers. That's
I
in
see. I see
academic
what you
world
mean by
at
that
least.
then.
You know. So and the reason that I every single class I teach. I always start with this question of how do we know what happened in the past? Right? How do we
Huh.
know it? And I ask the students to go do a practice. Think about a major event in your life, like a sweet 16 birthday party,
Yeah.
a prom night, Unfortunately, these are the examples that the students usually remember.
or they went or
It's
they went
not-
viral on social media or something like that.
something like that.
Yeah.
And then I said that, think about an event and go talk to 5 people who were present in that event and ask each of them what happened that night, right?
Yeah.
And see if they all come up with the same story.
Huh.
99.99% of the time, people come up with different kinds of stories. That what happened that night. Because for one thing, everyone sees the events from their own standpoint. They see their own self as a significant marker of what happened that night, right? And then after hearing all these stories, you wonder that were we in the same event? Like what happened? Because I remember things this way or that way, and some other person remembers it this way or that way, and that has to do with memory. But I said that just imagine that if it's hard to think about a single event that people were um, present there, and yet you have a problem coming up with a single story, about that event. What happens if you're thinking about an event in 13th century?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's a very complicated. I mean, on the surface, it's okay if people sit there and write about history, okay. But then when you think of it that way, that how do we then mark that event? And then the next question is, why that event is so important anyway? Why should we bother to think
Yeah.
about that event? And then you say, so what's the meaning of that event in human history? Because we write history in order to generate some form of meaning. And I'm highlighting this form of meaning here because I want to say that to say a sentence that immediately would take you to a different place, because we want to say that history doesn't happen in vain. When you hear that, where does it take you? It takes you to the church, right? Because life is not in vain, because life has a
Oh.
purpose, right? When we say that history has a purpose, history unfolds in a particular way. And then once you figure that out, because that's why the philosophy of history is so important, right? Because that's a question about the philosophy of history.
Yeah.
What's so important about events, and what do these events show us? And it tells us towards which direction history is unfolding. Once you
Okay.
figure that out, then you're in a good position to tell the story of the past. The story of the past is history, right?
So that still leaves me wondering two different things. First, well, I'm not wondering. I'm just surprised that you said history has a certain flow, has an internal logic. As a layperson, not as a scholar such as yourself, I've read many books. You can see them behind me, and I always walk away thinking, "Oh my God, this is just a series of accident and coincidence. If it didn't rain this day, the Ottomans would have conquered Vienna. If this didn't happen, that would have happened."
Right.
So I don't really see a logic. It's more like a bunch of things happening. I'm not negating. I'm sharing my experience with you. So the second thing, as we're looking for this meaning, which is really interesting, how does that translate into Middle Easterners' view of history?
First, let me say this: that I'm not a subscriber to that idea that history has a meaning that is going out. I mean, I'm just saying that this is what defined the discipline of history.
Oh, I see.
When the new discipline of history emerged, it was based on that premise that history has a direction.
Is that kind of like Marxism, where they had a specific view of history?
Marxism is basically the child of that way of thinking.
I see.
And you know, it's Hegelian, it's Enlightenment, the idea of progress, for example. I mean, the idea of progress is perhaps the most important part of the emergence of the discipline of history. Because if you believe that human societies are progressing, presumably you have an idea of what progress means. And it's only after the Enlightenment that you know, if you lived, for example, in I get to your question about Middle East and Islam and all that, but let me just say this, that if you lived in 9th century or 10th century, chances were like generation after generation of people who were born and die, they live under similar circumstances. You know,
it's sort of like a stagnant.
It appeared to be stagnant, right?
Yeah.
Because, you know, you're a child of a peasant, you're a child of a peasant. You're born child of a peasant, you die child a peasant, and then your children are peasants, and then you're so. It's only with the advent of Industrial Revolution, new sciences, and so on and so forth, that people start thinking that, wait a minute, the place we are born into cannot necessarily be the same place as when we die, because a lot of things would change. Like I remember my father sitting in front of a TV when the first moon landing happened. I'm that old, by the way. Of course, later we'll realize it was a hoax, right? You know?
Yeah, exactly.
And I mean, sobbing, crying, and I was a little boy, you know. And
your father was sobbing, crying?
Yes.
Okay.
Watching the moon landing, you know.
Yeah.
And my mom came into the room and said that, what are you doing? And my father said that, don't you see, you know, they landed on moon. I mean, who would have thought that something like this would happen during our lifetime, you know?
Yeah.
And of course, you know, now we are all ready for all these major changes happening in our lives.
Yeah.
And this idea that really started in the early 19th century to see these major transformations in life gave this kind of impetus, this kind of understanding that history is moving towards a particular direction, and that direction is the idea of progress. Right?
That is fascinating. So, in a way, if I may just paraphrase what you just this latter part of what you shared with me, progress of society through the industrial revolution itself, or progress of a state or technology. Also created this expectation of progress of individual life for people, and as a result, history must have some meaning of progress, which is entirely different frame of thought that, let's say, the 9th century or the 10th century, where you didn't really see progress.
Yes.
Interesting.
And then the fact that the important point is that, yes, it's true, the siege of Vienna happened, the war in World War happened, this happened, that happened, but all these things create this kind of zigging and zagging in history. But this zigging and zagging is moving towards a particular direction, and that direction is human progress. Right?
Yeah.
And in order to identify what is important in history, you need to identify which parts of historical thinking is in line with that sort of direction of history. You set aside things that are not all that important because they, at the end of the day, they are not going to make a difference in historical progress.
Yeah.
And then, the rest of it is quite important. Like, for example, people say that, the nation states, like idea of secularism, idea, all these things that become very important. For example, in order that, now I translate this, for example, in order to progress, modern states have to be secular, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do we know that? How do we know that? Because we experimented, we have trials and tribulations, and then we also realize that, progress, secularism is a big part of progress, and therefore we become very suspicious of anything religious in politics.
Oh, history plays a role in our understanding of this, because we
Of
see from
course, yeah,
history. I see what you mean. In a way, that also applies to democracy. We see countries that were democratic,
yeah,
they had
yeah,
progress, but now some have thrown that in doubt, saying, look at the UAE or look at
yeah,
China. They're not democratic, yet
yeah,
they are economically as a whole
yeah. So
progressing all.
because yeah, I mean, we are living in a very interesting time, because of course, possibly the most important part of that conversation is that when in mid 20th century, the great German critical philosophers argued that destruction is the price of progress. The
Huh.
destruction is the price of progress. Today, I don't think any person with a little bit of awareness of what's happening in the world would question that assertion, because we are basically facing the greatest challenge of entire human civilizations with climate change
Yeah.
and ecological disasters that are happening. And
I thought you were going to say the 2024 election, but
that's that's so tiny in
yeah,
comparison
I know,
to
I know, I know.
what awaits us.
When
So
go ahead, please.
yeah. So uh, and I want to say that this kind of thinking about history, because I want to go back to your question on religion and history, and to say that thinking about history along these lines post Enlightenment has actually a lot to do with religious thinking, because when
Hmm.
all religions, uh, mostly Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam,
Mm-hmm.
as well as Hinduism, Buddhism, they all have this thing we call eschatology.
Mm-hmm.
Eschatology meaning the end times, how times end, and towards which direction human life is unfolding. In Islam, they said that the day of judgment, right?
Yeah.
Because all religions believe in a final destiny. In a sense, eschatology is a part of theology, and in a sense, if you don't believe that there is indeed a final destiny, it would be very, very hard to have religious conviction.
Yeah.
People have religious conviction because they believe there is a final destiny and there is a day of judgment. And it's concerned about death, what happens after death. And that idea of eschatology was secularized, in a sense, after the Enlightenment, to say that instead of thinking about the final destiny as something above and beyond earthly life, we can think about that final destiny as part of earthly life.
Oh, that's fascinating, and that
So
gets us back to history.
absolutely, this is like,
Oh,
you know,
wow. And as you were sharing that with me, Dr. Ghamari-Tabrizi, the need for envisioning an end in theology or history is kind of a human condition. As you were sharing this about Abrahamic religions, you also mentioned Buddhism and Hinduism. I thought of actually the books I've read about the Aztecs and the Incas. They also have cycles in which the earth ends and restarts. So it's a
absolutely,
human need here that we're talking about.
yeah. I mean, this is exactly the way we make sense of our lives, right? I mean, humans always try to make sense of their lives, and that trying to make sense of their lives for the longest time had a very explicit religious undertone. For some, more in cyclical terms. For Abrahamic religions, very linear.
Yeah.
The Abrahamic religions, you start from, point A, you go towards point Z.
Abraham comes
that,
and a bunch of the prophets come
yeah.
and things happen. Yeah.
But in Buddhism, it's about cyclical. Hinduism, cyclical. Native religions in America is more cyclical. But nevertheless, they all think about this issue of what is the purpose of life. Earlier I said that, is life in vain?
Yeah.
Is a very, very, very important concept, question that infiltrates the way we think about history. Yeah. Because then,
which goes back to what you said before, history doesn't happen in vain.
Right.
Exactly.
It has a purpose.
Yeah.
In this kind of scatology, I'm trying to avoid this kind of terms that might not be that familiar with your audience. But that's what the scatology is, the idea of how do we get and what is that final destiny in life. In post-Enlightenment, that idea turned into a historical philosophy that we call a teleological view of history. A teleological view. Meaning what? Meaning that history started from a point and is moving towards a particular desirable end, right? As you said, Marx perhaps is the easiest person to understand what he means by this kind of teleological view, because he believed that history started from communal, primitive communist societies without classes, societies that the division of labor was equal and just, and then no private property, and then it moved to a next stage of slavery, and then feudalism, and then capitalism, and then socialism, and then communism, right? So you see that every stage of history follows the other one. Yeah. And it goes towards, if in religions, like in Abrahamic religions, you desire unity with the divine at the end of life, and you build that heaven with joining the divine. And Marx basically saying that don't need to wait for the divine. You can build that heaven right here. Communism, classless society in which that everyone is equal, and there is a radical fundamental justice in society. That's the divine on earth, right?
Now that you explain it, Dr. Ghamari-Tabrizi, I see so much correlation between religion and Islam, and how modern way of thinking about history is actually an offspring of religious thought. I want to continue this conversation in the context of Islam in the Middle East. So we'll be back after a short break to talk about revolutionary Shiaism, Islamic political thought, and a highly influential Muslim intellectual of the 20th century.